Ah, great. If I could call us to order, please. It's 10:30. Good morning again. I'm thrilled. Well, I'm thrilled to be moderating two panels today on topics very close to my personal and professional heart. And I guess as a constitutional and administrative lawyer by trade, the panel on big data and government accountability speaks to me especially directly. I also want to say, I've said to some people yesterday, it occurred to me as each of these fabulous panels has unfolded, every one of these panels could sustain its own, not just its own two-day conference, but its own set of courses. And, we could just turn every speaker's talk into a syllabus for a semester course and have a fabulous degree program. But this is just an abundance of riches. And I should also add that our panel is a perfect way to celebrate Sunshine Week, which is an annual initiative of the American Society of News Editors and the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press to shed light on government transparency or government opaqueness, as we probably have more often. Because extensive bios for our panelists appear online and in your programs, I'm going to introduce them now just very briefly in the order in which they will speak. We're going to lead off with Scott Klein, who's the award-winning senior editor for news applications at ProPublica. His team projects have included Dollars for Docs, which lets users search for pharmaceutical company payments to their doctors, and the Opportunity Gap, which lets users search their own schools and school districts to see how fairly those school districts distribute educational opportunity among high and low poverty schools. Then second will be Gary Bass at the end of the panel. He's executive director of the Bauman Foundation in Washington, D.C., and an affiliated professor at Georgetown University's Public Policy Institute. He's been a leader throughout his career in promoting government accountability and transparency and increased citizen participation in public policy decisions. We've had a privilege of knowing each other for quite some time. Our third speaker, Laurenellen McCann, was until recently the National Policy Director for the Sunlight Foundation, where she led Sunlight's work on local transparency issues. Through the Curious Citizens Project, which she recently founded with Ben Wickler, she helps municipalities and change agents cause what she calls, and I hope will explain, as civic mischief. So that's our lineup, and we'll start with Scott.
Hi, everybody. First of all, thanks, Peter, for inviting me and for convening this remarkable conference. I am coming from a somewhat different perspective than some of the other folks here. As Peter said, I'm a journalist, and I'm going to be talking a bit about how journalists think about data, and I'm also going to be talking about it through a historical frame that goes back a bit further than I think folks are used to. I work at ProPublica in New York, just by show of hands, to help me figure out how much to explain ProPublica. How many people know ProPublica? So it's getting better. So ProPublica is a nonprofit journalism outlet. We're based in New York City. We were founded back in the year 2008 and we have a mission, I will show you the next slide, to expose abuses of power, failure for the powerful to vindicate the responsibilities they've been given through investigative journalism. So we're a charitable nonprofit founded by the former editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal, who has since taken a more emeritus position at the organization. And what my department does, I run a team of about 10 programmer journalists, so they're folks who are as skilled at coding as they are at journalism. So they write code, they make phone calls, they design front-facing web applications that do a sort of a relatively new kind of data journalism that actually exposes data to people directly. So It's not just we use data to inform a story, we analyze a lot of data in order to explain things to people. We actually also show that data to people. Peter was saying the opportunity gap. This is an app that we did. It makes it so that people can look themselves up in big data sets. So this is the entire data set that the Office of Civil Rights has about educational opportunities. It's not just assembling this data. And these are other projects that we've done that Peter's already mentioned. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of data-driven journalism as a way to kind of explain how journalists think and the pitfalls we have hit in the past and hopefully are getting better at. A lot of people think this guy invented data journalism 2 years ago. That is not the case. We all love him. We all love Nate, but he didn't make it up. Really smart observers, if there are any J-School professors here in the room, will know that 1967, the pioneering work in using survey design in journalism was done by a guy named Phil Meyer, who was studying the 1967 riots in Detroit and wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning story about it. But that, too, was not the beginning of data journalism. Even smarter people will know the great story about how the UNIVAC computer predicted the 1952, an error on the slide, election, in which Adlai Stevenson was roundly defeated by Dwight Eisenhower, though the conventional wisdom at the time was that it was going to be a close race. In fact, this was not only not the first example of data journalism, it wasn't even the first example of electoral data journalism. Here is an example from 1896 of the San Francisco Chronicle publishing a choropleth map, that's what you call this, the day after the McKinley-William Jennings Bryan election of 1896, showing who won. This is sort of a remarkable piece of information design as well. And this, which I just found the other day, is a piece of election results journalism from 1788, so before the Constitution was even signed. We have examples of data journalism. And you can go back all the way to the beginning of journalism. You can find examples from the very beginning of newspapers, before they were called newspapers, before they even had what we now might consider news. You will find examples of stock tables and commodity tables and shipping news and things that anyone today would recognize as informational data journalism. So the name of my talk, I'm calling it Big Data Past because we're at a conference called Big Data Future. And I want to talk a bit about one specific story from the middle of the 19th century about Horace Greeley. Show of hands again. Hopefully this will be a smaller number. Who knows who Horace Greeley was? About the same as ProPublica. You've got to work on that. So Horace Greeley was a fascinating figure from the middle of the 19th century. Most people know him for saying, "Go west, young man," technically something he never said, but he said things very close to it. But he was a big believer in manifest destiny. He was a conflicting, troublesome, fascinating, frustrating guy. He was a vegetarian. He was a big believer in westward expansion and manifest destiny. He was what we would now call a communist and a Republican. Back when that was not contradictory. He published Karl Marx in the New York Tribune, his paper at the time. He was a strict abolitionist who was at first against the Civil War. He was sort of a constant pain in Abe Lincoln's neck. He was a Republican who ran for president against Ulysses Grant, as with the Democratic Party's under the name of the Democratic Party as well as the party he made up. So he was a kind of a funny, weird guy. This is actually a very representative picture of him. He was a hippie of the First Order, and the more you read about him, the more you adore the guy. As was true in the middle of the 19th century, he was a very powerful guy. He was the leader of one of the leading penny press journals of the middle of the 19th century. These are the New York Herald, the New York Tribune, New York Times, that essentially made up what we now know as modern news. And he was an innovative guy, technically innovative guy, one of the first people to bring linotype to America. He was an amazing figure. But he was, among many things, desperate to get into politics. And there are many letters from him to various politicians saying that he'll get rid of his newspapers if you just elect me to office. I'll take anything. Make me postmaster, make me public printer. And so they finally, he was a big pain in the neck, nobody really wanted him to be in office, but they finally gave him one 3-month appointment to the US Congress to fill in the seat of somebody who had lost his seat because of corruption. So he was, for 3 months in 1848, 1849, the congressman from 14th Street up in Manhattan, which gives you sort of a sense of how long ago this was. There was only one congressman from there. And he did, this is my alternate name for this, antebellum big data. He did a big data project for the time. When he got there, the first thing he noticed was that he got a lot of money for mileage reimbursement, based not on how actually long it took him to get to DC, because there was a train then, just like there is now, so it was not much time. But in fact, the mileage was calculated by the usual customary route, which was determined by a congressional committee that sort of gave people lots and lots more mileage than they really deserved. So, of course, being a pain in the neck, he wrote an investigative story about it, about a week and a half after he started in Congress. It was called The Mileage of Congress, and you can see, this ought to start moving. He published, along with a story about all of this stuff, the exact figures for all of his fellow congressmen, exactly how much mileage they got, exactly how much the post office says is the distance between their district and Washington, D.C., and then calculated very helpfully for readers how much excess that represented and how much money of everyone in America that they were taking. Oh, there we go. This is all 200 and something congressmen, all of the senators. Right, so this is nearly 2 columns of agate type. This is big data for 1848. You'll see in a second, this was sort of the biggest data project that anyone had known, at least at the Tribune until then. And an important thing, I don't have a ton of time, so I'm going to talk only a little bit about this. Let no man jump at the conclusion that this excess has been charged and received contrary to law. The fact is otherwise. The members are all honorable men. If any irreverent infidel should doubt it, we can silence him by referring to the prefix to their names in the newspapers. You should read 19th century newspapers are all like this. They're fantastic. We assume that each has been charged precisely what the law allows him, and therefore we press home the question, ought not that law be amended? You can see that he got some pretty big fish. Here's 2 future presidents. One of them, Andrew Johnson, who's kited $122.40, and Honest Abe Lincoln, who was sort of in the top 15 from Illinois, so far away, $676.80, which is about 20 grand today. So he's essentially accusing 2 future presidents of stealing money from the. So he's really making friends. Remember, he's a sitting congressman right now, and he published all of this. There was a lively debate in which he did not make a lot of friends. A species of demagogism of which this is William Sawyer, who got an extra $281 of Ohio. Here, selected because we're in Ohio. This is the low, groveling, base, and malignant desire, said Representative Thomas Turner from Illinois, who got an extra $1,000. However, the newspapers of the day and the public sentiment was essentially on Greeley's side. He could sort of do no wrong back then, but with big exceptions. Exposing the fraudulent manager of calculating and paying the mileage, but this is actually the best part of this. Mr. Greeley set down the excess to their honor. This was not altogether a judicious move for Mr. Greeley as a member of this House, especially considering how extravagantly nice some of these bloated crib suckers are about honor. The Sandusky Clarion, also Ohio. There's a lot of lessons that journalism has learned since then. It was a great project, and I think he was exactly right, and we'll kind of get to the impact that he had. But he did a bunch of stuff wrong, and we are much better at it in data journalism now, and I want to talk a bit about this. The first is that data can tell its own stories if you expose it to people in a sort of non-careful way. The story can kind of get away from you. So remember, this is what he said. He said, I'm not saying that anyone stole anything. I'm just saying that the law ought to be amended. And he was almost certainly being cute about this because he was really, really accusing everybody of stealing. Ought not that law to be amended. However, the cribsuckers said, that he was imputations of fraud, slanderous charges. I have been charged with grand larceny, and then the next sentence he says the speaker has been charged with petty larceny, and they make a lot of jokes about trading each other's larceny, and I wish I'd got more money. And this is, again, the charge was directly upon me. I was accused directly. So this is a key difference that we have learned since then between exposing data to people versus analyzing it and expressing it to people in stories. It can be much more powerful, and you have to be very careful about how you label it, very careful with how you explain it to people. Context is incredibly important. The other thing we've learned is that it's still journalism, and if it's been invented yet, you need to pick up the phone and call the people who are being mentioned. Obviously, if you're doing 200 congressmen, or if you have a database of 1 million doctors, you can't call all of them, but you really ought to call the ones who are being mentioned in your story, the ones who are going to get really upset because they are the sort of maxes and the people who seem to be getting the most money. He was in D.C. There were no phones then, but he could easily have walked over. One of the kind of punches that lands in the congressional record is somebody says, had he not taken the time to ascertain the facts, you should bulletproof. So there are 20 at least math errors that I detected. The same guy, William Sawyer from here in Ohio, claims the entire thing is false, and he has hundreds of statements, and he never reveals what these are, but hundreds of false statements in it. But I counted at least 20 simple arithmetic errors, and if you go through the newspaper record, it really is sort of spending the next 6 months or so responding to letters saying, hey, you got this wrong, here you did the math wrong, oh, I'm sorry. And the reporter who he got to do all of this work apologizes for the arithmetic errors, and then later in the thing says it was all Greeley's idea. And also, and this is, I think, maybe the most important thing, and certainly for these proceedings, the most important thing, exposing data like this, using data itself as journalism, as stories for people to read for themselves and make their own minds up, has impact. So for all of their grousing and for all of their complaining and all of their anger, the House passed overwhelmingly exactly what Greeley said should be passed, which was a law that changed the way that mileage was computed, so that no matter how long it took you to get to Congress, you got a fair amount. So bad news is the Senate killed it, so this is not a new story either, and it wasn't for a good 60 years before this really became the system we have now, which is that congressmen each get a budget and they can spend it on mileage if they want, but they're not getting extra. So that's my story.
Gary?
What you didn't tell everyone is how good you are at data-driven journalism today, and that you don't follow the Horace Greeley.
Oh, no, yes. No, it's all mistakes we've learned from since 1848.
It's really a pleasure to be here, because as someone who has worked for about a little over 3 decades on pushing for open government, I tend to walk in different circles. So it was extremely interesting to hear from the perspective of researchers, social scientists, and businesses the view of big data. In my world, big data is perceived as a very heavy negative. It's associated with things like loss of credit card information, or with intelligence agencies surveilling people, particularly now in the sense of bulk data and phone systems. It's perceived as data brokers selling medical information about families. And in fact, that's precisely why the president spoke to the nation just a short while ago about the activity of intelligence agencies, and why he had a senior White House advisor, John Podesta, work on these issues, as well as Secretary Johnson from the Homeland Security Administration, as well as the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House just a couple weeks ago announced a request for comments from the public around use of big data and its impact. Big data both from business and from government. So in my world, and you mentioned Peter, Sunshine Week. Last week I was at the inaugural event with advocates and journalists, and most saw this as really a threat. The word big data is much more an issue about secrecy, which is why a number of groups from that meeting are now preparing a letter to the president to express concern. So it's interesting to hear all the kind of positives when there is such a rush going on today that looks at big data in such negative lights. When we come to government accountability, for me, it's not about big data. It's about the right information. And it can be big data. It can be small data. It can be one document. It can be access to a meeting. It can be really just about anything. So the issue is getting the right information to ensure that government is held accountable. But it's not just getting information. It is also empowering people to use that information. And without that empowerment, data and access mean nothing. So whether it's through the journalism approach that Scott was just talking about or through other means, accountability has to have the right information and in the right way. Now, you went back all the way to the 19th century. Let me just do a quick, get you on the Wayback Machine, just to go back for a few years. Let's go back to 2007. And we had just come through an administration, the Bush administration, where information was actually probably one of the most secret administrations, certainly in modern times. It was hard to get information, and in the post-9/11 terrorism environment, information was literally being taken down off of websites. It was harder to get information. I was then running an organization called OMB Watch, and in the post-Katrina, Hurricane Katrina environment, we could not get information about how spending was going. It sounded very similar to what people were talking about with Hurricane Sandy. So we started working with then Senator Barack Obama and Tom Coburn. These are, in politics, yin and yang, left and right. And we developed a bill that said, put all government spending online in a searchable format. And people said, that can't be done. The Congressional Research Service said, if you do it, it'll take at least 5 years and over $15 million a year to do. And so OMB Watch, this little shop, we said, okay, well, if we can't get the bill done, we'll create a website. And we did it in 2 months. It cost us $200,000. And at its peak, we had 1 million visitors a month coming. Lo and behold, the bill actually became law right around the time we opened up our website, which was called fedspending.org. And the government said, well, your site's really cool. Can we have your site? And so we negotiated a deal, and today usaspending.gov came from our site. So I speak with some experience when I say it isn't just putting the data up. The issue is that under the spending side, you may not even be getting the right information that you want. Under the Recovery Act, I wanted some information about performance data. How were they dealing with the money? I couldn't get that. That wasn't available. It also is an issue about the question of not only is it the question of what information is collected, it's also about the quality of the data. One of the biggest issues we saw with the spending data is it was just flat out wrong. Garbage in, garbage out. What value is that? On top of that, I would say it's a question about access. It isn't just giving people the data. Yes, many of you are developers in this room, but what we need to do is empower the public to give people the tools to use the data. We need the websites, we need other vehicles to help people analyze that data. And that brings me to the last experience I had with that spending data, and that is in the terms that you all were talking yesterday about things like architecture and interoperability and APIs. In addition, we need to build the platforms in a way that make it, if you will, mashable. You've got to have corporate identifiers. You've got to have other identifiers so we can link with disparate data sets. Otherwise, Acme in this database may not be the same Acme in this database, and as a result, we're getting all these false data going out and accusations, and people don't use the phone as much as you said you should do. So let me just shift back to yesterday a little bit also, in the notion that there was sort of a feeling in the room about, well, if we could just have a lot of transparency and self-regulation, everything would be great. And my reaction was, well, if Tinkerbell existed, it would be just great too. It's not the real world. For 30 years, I have fought tooth and nail to get the information publicly available. And for 30 years, not only government, but companies have fought tooth and nail to keep it from being public. I also put up in 1989 the seminal right to know data called Toxics Release Inventory on something called RTKNet. Every year since that point, industry has done its best to undermine the collection of that data. And during the Bush administration, because they couldn't get it done in Congress, they did a regulation to undermine the collection, and it was the Obama administration that replaced the regulation when it came in. This isn't just a benign thing. This is a fight that goes on all the time. When you think about campaign contributions, the solution everyone says, oh, more transparency. Well, short of the dark money that's come because of Citizens United, we have a lot of transparency on contributions. Has it gone down? No. It's at war of escalation. You could go on and on. We have a president who truly believes in public access and meaningful access to information. Have we seen major changes? We can't even get an inventory of data that the agencies hold, notwithstanding having memos and various edicts to do this. My point is that we need transparency, we need strong regulation, and we need even stronger enforcement of the regulations. And until we have that, we are going to be always in the state of getting less than quality information. So let me wrap up with sort of 5 points of where I think we could go today, and I could make it 50 points, but I've learned long ago to have 5, because then you can count them with this hand and be pounding like crazy with this hand. Yes, absolutely. So my 5 points are, the first thing is we should create some common standards across all agencies, frankly, all levels of government, where certain basic accountability information needs to be open and public in uniform ways. These are things like, who are the visitors coming? What are the schedules of the appointed political people? The communications that go to our state legislature or to our federal legislature should automatically be open. There are a whole host of these that, just as a standard, should be public and in a uniform way. Second, we have to reverse the presumption of the Freedom of Information Act. FOIA. FOIA works where we, the public, have to go ask for information, and they, the government, says yay or nay. What we need is an environment that switches it, that says the presumption is on openness, and government has a responsibility, an affirmative responsibility, to disseminate information. FOIA, as we know it today, should become a backbone or a safety net and should not be the first recourse. Thirdly, so first we've got the openness platform. Second, we've got to reverse the whole model of FOIA. Thirdly, we need to start focusing on which are the key data sets that can help us for accountability. For example, the president signed a memo a while ago calling for regulatory compliance and enforcement data to be publicly available. You can't get that kind of data even after the president pushed a memo out. We need to have data on enforcement so we can make sure that all the regulated community is held accountable. We need performance data. It isn't just how government spends, are we getting our money's worth? Is the money going to where the target's supposed to be? If bridges are broken in certain areas, why is the money not going to where it's broken instead of to the powerful congressional districts? If money is intended to go to low-income communities, why isn't it going there? We need to have performance data to know whether or not people are performing as government contractors. Another kind of critical data set that we need is really information to empower voters. We should have not only uniform information about elections and registration systems, we should have information about campaign contributions and lobbying disclosure. In fact, it was startling that it made national news this week that the Justice Department is actually going after one company who didn't file properly their Lobbying Disclosure Act data. The reason it was so shocking is because out of the history since 1996, there's only been about 2 or 3 cases that they've even bothered to do. So we need to get that data to really encourage meaningful enforcement. Fourth, beyond getting the key data, we have got to talk about data standards. Until we get the common formats and the common systems, whether they be XML or the building blocks like I was mentioning of the corporate identifiers, until we build those common standards, we are going to have this kind of fragmented system that we have today, and accountability is going to be extremely challenging, if not undoable. And fifth and finally, data quality. We cannot continue to put out data unless we start to talk about how we clean this data up. Now, it is true, my experiences with the toxics release inventory, it is true that as you put data out, the data itself gets better. That is, if people use it, companies report better information, government makes better information, but we need to have a much more rigorous system on data quality. So let me stop there and just conclude by saying that it isn't just about big data when it comes to government accountability. It's about getting the right information at the right time in the right way to empower people. And I think we can do it. And a lot of you have a lot of the skills that I hope to tackle or at least get somehow better associated with to help me do that kind of work. Thanks.
Laurenellen, you're up.
Excellent. All right, so we've spent some time in various portions of the past and a little bit of the sad present, but my job is to take us to the future, at least for state and local government. So, close your eyes, you don't have to. The year is 2025, and you've just come home from work, you flip on your local news, and this pops up on your screen. A local talking head is shooting off about the quality, the completeness, and the timeliness of your state's data. And not just any data, your legislative data. You're nodding along as he rails about the terrible missing years in the vote data and the fact that that information is locked in PDFs, and you totally get why that's a bad thing. You're not like, what is a PDF? And you can't search them or extract information easily from them? No, you knew that ahead of time. You're also completely on the same page when the Politico mentions that this travesty happens where it can take up to 4 days for the information to get online. How archaic. It's not like, back in 2014 when it can take months and sometimes years to get a response to your request for information, let alone the information itself. But of course, that is the present, and actually that broadcast was from something like the present. It was broadcast at this time last year. In the state of Massachusetts, the talking head in question was Jim Polito, and he was railing about the state's F grade on a scorecard from the Sunlight Foundation, which was measuring the legislative data. In theory, Jim's vision is what we're talking about when we talk about big or open data for open government, the ability to scrutinize in front of a popular and not a niche audience the technical quality of the information that our governments are releasing. And in case you're still kind of fuzzy on what we are talking about when we're talking about data, I will just say that we're not talking about this. This is an open data portal from the city of De Leon, Texas, or De Leon, which is one of the smallest cities in the country to have an open data portal. It's a population 2,400. What we're more so talking about is this. This is the city of Seattle's structured crime data in a CSV format. We're going to come back to this in a minute. Open data, information released from the government in particular formats. Gary was just nicely giving an overview there that we call open because they can be searched, sorted, machine processed more easily than, say, a PDF. We're talking about information that's free to use, that doesn't have license restrictions, so citizens have the ability to actually freely process, for example, the travel spending that we get from our governments. And it's published online where the public can actually access it. If you have a filing cabinet, you are not doing open data. Believe it or not, a lot of cities and states, and we're talking about, yeah, sure, 50 states, but depending upon how you count your municipalities, we could be talking about 40,000 units or 19,000 are actively engaging in something very similar to open data at this moment. A couple of examples. The city of Seattle. When we talked about data mashups before, we're talking about essentially this. In addition to the spreadsheet I just showed you a couple of slides ago, the city of Seattle also mashes up 911 call response data. They're one of, I think, only 3 or 4 cities in the country to do this. Why is this relevant? Well, one, the city itself is making use of their structured data, again, more like a spreadsheet than a PDF. But they're also demonstrating the ecosystem that exists around crime reporting, because the real crime in a city can't just be measured by the damage that's done, but about the government's response in trying to correct it. We're also seeing examples like this. So most municipalities that are engaging in information released in this way are following initiatives that started from the executive, from the mayor. This is a look at Philadelphia's dashboard. This is actually the chief technology officer's workflow in opening data. And so you can not only see what data they are planning to release, but when, as well as ideas and suggestions that are actively coming in from citizens. When we talk about inventories for data, we're talking about something like this, but a little bit further down. We actually want to see what's potentially available to be published. Although Philly hasn't completed that kind of data inventory, this is a step in that direction. And to be fair, no government unit has really completed that kind of inventory yet. We're also talking about this. So this idea that FOIA is reactive is actually a disease that exists in every single public records law around the country. But Utah used to have a pretty great one called GRAMA that was suddenly overturned in an overnight session by Utah's state legislatures in 2011. And in response, the citizens had their own kind of reactive disclosure, which was to flood the State House. This is an image from a protest of over 500, potentially up to 1,000 people that came in one night holding signs, protest signs that said, "Let the sunshine in, give us our data." What? Who has protests for this? It's amazing. But in response, over time, the Utah legislature decided to work with its constituents and actually passed an open data bill in 2013 as part of the long-term corrections on their public records law that moved from a system of reactive disclosure, where citizens had to ask before information was given, towards at least aspirational proactive disclosure, where the state would default to sharing to encourage less protesting and more functioning. These are just a few of many examples. There are something like 250 data portals that exist in municipalities and states around the country, but I actually think that's a pretty poor measure of what open data looks like in state and local government, because anybody can pay a contractor to set up a data portal. If you want to actually look at systematic approaches to releasing information, I think you have to look at policy initiatives. So in terms of that, within the United States, we've seen 6 states, Connecticut just passed the line in 2014, that have passed policies, 3-ish counties, which is, the ish is mostly related to the strangeness of how counties are incorporated, so don't worry about it, and over 20 cities at this point, which is a considerable momentum, you know? But I will definitely also note that not all of these policies are created equally. And I know this because I have read every single one of them. This is a screen cap of a project that was led by my team while I was at the Sunlight Foundation, where we actually analyzed every single policy against a series of guidelines that we constructed. These are policy guidelines which are built upon the framework of things like the Open Knowledge Foundation's Open Data Handbook, Sunlight's own materials, where we review what data should be public. This is about the variety of information collected by the government. How to make that data public. This goes back to the long and potentially confusing commentary about the structure and formatting of information, and how to implement policy, because that's the difference between slapping up a data portal and actually having a systematic approach to proactive information release. We've touched on a couple of the good, or the as the current slide demonstrates. But effectively right now in states and cities across the country, we are seeing a hyper-focus on the structure. more so than the federal government, municipalities are very invested in exploring the variety of benefits that a comma-separated file will get you, and data portals, which I'm less excited about. And they are executive-driven policies, which I'm calling out again in contrast to legislative-driven or things that have been passed by a Congress or city council. There's a real focus on civil service data. This is more about transportation than, say, campaign finance, but there's a budding interest in procedural data. This is just a category I made up to describe things that are more like budgets than buses. And again, we're starting to see a theme of aspirational proactive disclosure, but it will forever be aspirational until a government actually begins to publish proactively. And we're seeing a lot of gov-to-gov support. This is probably my favorite thing about working on the municipal level. Whether it's the mayor, the chief technology officer, the guy in IT who got a mandate suddenly dropped on his desk, people are reaching out to others to figure out how to do this. And the technical knowledge isn't just housed within any particular department or any particular city, it's distributed. Municipalities often operate something called patterning, which you can pretty much guess what that is. When one city does something, everyone else likes to be a fast follower, and it's easy to figure out how to do that. And it's excellent to see that this principle that's often been talked about in urban planning has really been picking up in the data sphere. This slide should say the frontier, but it doesn't. And this is what we are not seeing as much of happening. On the municipal level, everything is very executive driven because city council legislation takes a long time and city councils are wonky and have all their own insidery issues. Who would imagine given our Congress? States have only been legislating their open data policies with the exception of New York State. We don't know yet what the actual long-term implication of this is, except that executive policies are not necessarily as stable as those that are passed by a council. Because when you get a new mayor in, they might not want to continue on the mandate from a previous mayor. So that's something to keep in the back of your head when we talk about how sustainable these efforts are. There's also this question of data prioritization. This was something that Gary was just touching on. What information to release when is a huge issue, and we tend to only leave that in the court of technical people, of developers who are instantly using the data today instead of thinking about who will be using the data tomorrow and who we want to be using the data tomorrow. There are a couple of great efforts that have happened to try and bring in non-technical stakeholders, like those of us from the nonprofit community. Journalism, we might be technologists, but not all of our work exists inside the developer's console, and we have a stake in the future of data too. Cities tend to be ignoring that. We're also not seeing inventories or the release of new data, which touches on the most painful part to me of the frontier, I will say, because I'm not calling it the not so good, which is definitions of data. Here's the thing about law and policy. What you define becomes reality. So if your definition of data is recursive, such as Chicago's, which says that public data should be public data, and public data that is online should be public data that is online. That's not actionable at all, and that actually limits the scope of what you're able to release, interact with anything in perpetuity to a very small set of data that happen to already be on the internet. That's a huge problem, and that's not something that there's a really great constructive conversation on, particularly at the municipal level. Earlier, I said this was the future. A future where we are talking about votes and technical details, and that the challenge then is technical. But I posit, as you'll now notice is a theme of our entire panel, that the actual challenge is cultural. And this is as much for citizens, constituents of any government level, as it is for the government itself. Because I don't know about you, but my vision of open government at any level is not about spreadsheets and whining about information I don't have. It's actually about data-driven decision-making that doesn't have to look like a spreadsheet. It looks a lot more like this. Particularly on the municipal level, we should be able to take advantage of the fact that you can walk into your city hall and meet with your council person. This is an image from a DC council meeting. Don't worry, they're not all like this, where we are actually addressing some of the inadequacies with our hyperlocal unit of government, area neighborhood councils, and their ability to communicate with constituents about the small decisions like street lamps that the ANCs actually deal with. They're not all going to be data jams. You don't always have to be technical. But I believe that an accountable local government is one where the government's proactive disclosure isn't aspirational, but active, and where citizen feedback isn't reactive, but productive, important, and demonstrated clearly in the policy that results. So, on that note, as a nice bookend to the fact that I guess at the federal level and the local level we're still scratching for things, I will leave you here. Thanks.
I want to invite people from the audience to step up to the microphones, or I'm going to unleash a torrent of questions which these fabulous presentations have raised in my own mind. I guess I can't resist asking one. And I just want to thank the design professor yesterday who talked about the Black Death in Europe, so the bubonic plague, so I don't have to be accused of having the most depressing topic. Journalism. So, or more importantly, more generally, the role of intermediaries. What the information that, to be actionable, I think what Laurenellen and Gary are trying to get at has to be translated by people who are not, as Laurenellen just said, not just the technical stakeholders. And Scott, you've worked out what's an incredibly powerful model at one level, although you have even you can't do everything, but at least at the national and even international level, there's enough scale to what you're doing to attract the kind of support to sustain your effort. I'm wondering, what hope there is for generating the kind of translators, intermediaries at the state and local level on a sustainable basis that will be able, even if we have all of the proactive disclosure in the world, are we actually going to have information that, a democratic public can act upon?
I certainly hope so. I'm doing my part.
For sure.
I talked a lot about the past. I'm not a historian of any stripe, but during the day, I spend all of my energy, and as do the people who work in my team, trying to turn data into stories, and we think that there's a lot of power in that kind of. We take sort of sports as our model. Sports has been using data for hundreds of years, and people can look at the data themselves and tell themselves the story of how a baseball game was played or the season of a football team. And so we believe very strongly that people are smart and can interpret things for themselves, and if we are able to structure the data, I'm a designer by trade as well as a journalist, and we believe very strongly that if we, using interaction design and visual design, display raw data to people, that they would be able to act on it in their own communities. That journalism traditionally kind of uses anecdotes, right? And if you have a great reporter, he can find a specific anecdote that really kind of drives the story home. And on my team, we can do millions of anecdotes. We can show you personally. And it takes some effort. That having been said, and yes, it sort of takes a special team of people with very specific skills. But every newspaper in the country has sports reporters who can work with more complex data than the stuff that we do. Not every project uses machine learning. A lot of this is just very simple descriptive statistics. If you can sort of column in Excel, you can do data journalism. This is something that's well within the ken of the Columbus Dispatch and the Cleveland Plain Dealer and the Akron paper and other papers here in Ohio. So every news organization in the country can do this, and I am doing everything I can to get them to do it.
I would also say that there's, even though I was hating a bit on spreadsheets, in certain audiences there tends to be a fixation on file formats like XML, and I think that's where we're actually beyond necessarily everyday use or even traditional expert use in non-developer circles. But to the point that Scott just made, I think that civil society actors, journalists, they use spreadsheets in their analysis. I think that's a big part of it. And even things like for budgeting, the government plays a role in not necessarily translating the information, but making it accessible within context. So if you're familiar with participatory budgeting, this involves a certain amount of transparency related to how the government is going to spend money, enough so that citizens can actually participate in the allocation of it. And I think when you have applications like that that are, in certain contexts, that enables people to have a higher level of data fluency than if they're necessary. It's not like we're kind of out in the wilderness. And I actually tend to believe more is more, can release more data because people will self-select in their ability to use it. I just don't want to plan for a future where the current users are the only users.
Great.
By the way, it's the Beacon Journal.
And Peter, I thought it was an insightful question because I actually wrote down after I spoke of what I didn't mention was role of intermediaries. So it's very important. I had the most enlightening experience. We did some polling data, and the first step to do it was focus groups. And we took this was one of the settings was Michigan with union workers. So we thought, okay, we'll bring some right-to-know data, both workplace and the toxics release inventory, and literally test how they use it. And we thought, oh, this would be a snap, they'll get it, this is wonderful. So they went through these sheets of information about chemicals being released and all the health impacts, and they kind of squinted and said, oh yeah, this is interesting stuff, we know about it. And so the moderator kind of picked up and sort of pushed a little bit further and said, would you use it? No. And it's like we're in the back room going, oh my God, this is terrible news. And then the moderator asked the next question, why is it important? And they said, well, that's what we expect our union to do, is to analyze it and give us what the impact is, so then we'll take and do something with it. And I think that is exactly the role of the intermediary, whether it's from the journalist point of view or the nonprofit. It's to give that a tool, to give that analysis in a way that empowers people to take action.
Caroline, I think you were first. Okay.
Hi, my name is Alyssa Griff-Miller. I actually work here at Ohio State, but have worked in state and local government here in Ohio in the past. And so my question is really coming from that practical standpoint of, I've seen a lot of people in government say that if we collect the data, then it will get misused, that it will be distorted in the news media and it will show a bad story about what it is we're trying to do in government. How do we, if truly having data available to the public is a good, how do we convince the politicians that releasing data is good? And then also, collecting that data and having people there to collect it costs money. How do we convince the public that investing in that, and when they see that public disclosure of those salaries and that infrastructure, that that was a good use of their funds?
So I actually wrote a series called Reasons Not to Release Data, in which there were 50 reasons that we crowdsourced, and I rebutted each and every one of them. So these are two topics that were close at hand, particularly for local governments. What do you do if you're going to be critiqued publicly? I mean, you're going to be critiqued anyway because you're the government. I think that's one of the big things that we have to deal with. Something that's common in a lot of governments that has got them over the line of disclosure is adding a disclaimer. It kind of is annoying as an advocate to see a disclaimer that says the government's not liable for any inaccuracies that you see here. But if that's the difference between you releasing data and not, I think that's appropriate, at least for the present tense. So that's one thing that we've often used, actually in conversations with Cuyahoga County during some work a few years ago, got the county to begin to release data using that kind of disclaimer. You also, as the government, have the ability, if somebody critiques you inappropriately, you have access for that data too. You can release a press release and correct the journalist who misquoted you or misused the data. And I think that government's already engaging in that activity, so to the extent that, particularly for municipalities and states, you can tell them it fits into normal workflows already. You just have to take 2 seconds to get your staff up to speed. It makes a world of difference. The other thing in terms of staff costs that I find really interesting is more people tend to be concerned that they're going to be putting staff out of work by doing all these system upgrades. But those are just people that you'll be able to reallocate potentially to other systems of work. So I think that the messaging, obviously, from the government has to be genuine and in line, and they also need to get what they're doing in order to do messaging like that. But I think that the public is going to be a lot more forgiving if they're able to see the results, if they're able to get access to the data, if the quality of reporting improves because they have access to more data. And I think that there's absolute ways to communicate that to government that makes it sound either like the status quo with a little bit more technology, which makes them look good, or just makes them look good.
Yeah, I just have one really brief thing to add. I can't paint a rosy picture, and there are many, many more government agencies that try to hide than are all that eager to reveal. But we do have relationships with some, big government agencies where we have found that, over time, working with them, showing that we can be careful with the data so we're not kind of exposing PII, things that they're genuinely worried about that are not just reputational, but actually kind of genuine concerns. We can allay those concerns by just doing great work over and over again. But I think that I have found the one ray of hope is that for every government employee who is trying to hide incompetence or malfeasance or whatever, there are others who are eager to have that information get out. So there is no kind of monolithic kind of agency's opinion about releasing the data. There are people within each of these agencies that want their data turned into stories, the good or the bad. So, I think it's changing, and it's partly changing because there are responsible data journalists on some level, unlike poor Horace Greeley, who understand exactly how to explain data, how to apply meaningful caveats, how to analyze it in fair ways. So it's getting better.
I have a longer answer that which I'll do after because there are a lot of people, but I will say we have to acknowledge we live in a gotcha politics world. You put something out there, someone's going to go after you. It's a challenge.
Hi, David Landsberg, and I'm at the Glenn School, and really appreciated the comments, very useful. Right now we're working on legislation in Ohio to open up data for both state and local governments, and that's proving to be a real challenge. So I agree with a lot of the statements made, the importance of not only providing the data, but the tools to be able to use it, and I find that's really lacking in many of these data portals. But some of the things that you converged on was the standards question, and that's the ability to do apples-to-apples comparisons. And that's turning out to be a really difficult problem for us because, standards is more than just converting that PDF file to an RTF by pushing a button. It really goes all the way down to the front level where how people collect information, what questions they ask, what their production is of that data. So you're fundamentally asking, when you're asking people to converge on standards, you're asking them how to do things differently in local government. You'll find in budget items, $0 allocated for IT or energy. Well, they just do it differently. They have a different way of budgeting. So we have certainly hope that we can use this local data, and the hope is that there's convergence in practice, and though it might not be 100% quality, 80% of the local governments do things similarly, but still there's that standards question. And I wonder, when we are so quick to ask government to have convergence on standards, are we really realizing how difficult that is to do, number one, and where can we do that? And number two, yesterday we had a pretty good discussion about standards organizations on the technical level, and they can do it because they put some engineers back in a room and they decide what the next generation mobile technology will look like. But if we're asking about standards organizations, we don't even have any in local government. We don't have any. And how would you do that? And who would be the players around the table that would agree on what standards we should adopt? So if you know of any good practices, how you do that, maybe at the state, which is hard enough, or the federal government, but especially local government, we would certainly appreciate your advice on how to do that.
And to complicate it even further, we should be doing that intergovernmentally, that is, local to state to federal.
Exactly. Yeah.
So just to add to it, but I think it's a great statement rather than giving an answer.
Yeah, no, I'm looking for to see what you've seen there.
So here's like this exact problem is what killed California's open data bill that they tried to pass in 2012. And as I always say, between you and me, but now I've said that to a ton of people, so too bad. It was a really bad bill, so it shouldn't have passed. And I'm actually okay that the League of Cities killed it. What Utah did, because they wanted to be able to, in the future, right, they wanted to start with state agencies, which was my recommendation to them, and then continue to iterate it out and hit other agencies, local agencies, counties, et cetera. They targeted the state agencies first, then created a transparency advisory board that included representatives from the state and local level, the county level, state and local, the local level, county level, journalists from both state and local, darn it, municipal and county. And anyway, a variety of actors who came together. And so as the state is going through this process of standardizing, they had these representatives in the room who were able to flag and be like, that's not going to fly in these counties because we don't even collect that kind of information and we wouldn't know how to structure it. And so as the state was getting on, and is in the process of getting on board, they're going to be able to use some of their resources in helping, and they've been able to more finely target what the challenges are. I think also, and this is probably bad as somebody who supports open data, that it's better to learn how to start publishing, to start addressing that cultural aspect, than necessarily you have to launch into the technical right away. And one recommendation that I gave to a couple of townships in New Jersey of like 10,000 people that are trying to publish their data is if you're able to do a click to download link, to even if you only have Excel files at the beginning, you're creating the space where later you can go in and fill in the technical. And I think that when you're looking at local governments that don't have a lot of resources, that don't have a lot of technical ability, you can create a zip file and install a URL, click to download pretty easily. That's not the most exciting answer I could give.
My concern is that if we start this early process of saying just start it, we can learn, we can clean up the data, we can start to converge on standards. We're in the honeymoon period now, and we're providing all kinds of opportunities to download data. What happens when people finally realize that they can't compare the data, that they can't do anything with the data? Will their high expectations, low results, what will that do?
But doesn't that create the kind of popular support you need to get funding to fix it?
It's an open question.
There are three, by the way, there are three steps I would take that don't directly answer, but one is we have to find the resources to make metadata available. And that's probably the most important, because without the metadata you can't compare. You don't know the app, whether you got an apple or an orange. The second is implicit in what Laurenellen just said is, at a minimum, let's get XML standards out there. Let's get some uniform standard. Maybe in the financial it's XBRL. I don't know what they are. And the third is we need some common identifiers. That's the only way. And frankly, I think we need federal leadership so that companies have a common identifier and that everyone's using that. And you can broaden it beyond just companies. But
Hi, my name is Melissa Bilancini, and I'm Policy Coordinator with the ACLU of Ohio. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about lately that I would like to hear your thoughts on is the challenges that come with public-private partnerships. We've seen this increasing in our state, at both the state and the local level, and that really decreases the amount of transparency and accountability that we have.
just as a humorous story, when we went to put up the spending data, there was a database on government contracts. Well, it turns out that the General Services Administration contracted out the maintenance of the contracts. And by doing that, Freedom of Information Act did not apply to the private company. So we couldn't even get the contract information on the United States government and money they were spending. And then they wanted to charge us money to get to the information. Well, you haven't heard all hell be raised until you've gone through that experience. A number of us complained, and we got the data for free. And even though they still contract out, it's not, you can still get to the information. My point is that there is this notion that by privatizing or building partnerships, you move inherently governmental functions outside of the nature of government. And that has got to be addressed. That's a policy issue. It's not a technical issue. And it's one that all of us should be proudly fighting for to make sure that there is real access.
And I think just to piggyback on that note, so obviously when I worked at the Sun Life Foundation, we were working with state and local governments. You give different advice to the local governments than you do to the state. And as I was just saying before, we often advised states that were kind of coming in from zero to start by targeting state agencies and then reviewing what provisions they could apply immediately to contractors and to public-private partnerships for disclosure before beginning to go into the weeds of mandates on the local level. So to your point, I just want to underscore, I think it's absolutely a policy issue and one that gets skipped a lot. And one litmus test I use a lot, I was just telling my fellows here earlier, whenever I'm presented with a new budget website from a state or city, is I immediately see if I can find the spending allocation that created the website. And I never can, because it's always done through subcontractors. And if you don't have your subcontractor data, then I'm not going to get very excited about your brand new shiny platform.
I think this gentleman is next.
Good morning. I'm the guy on the other side of the table. I am an IT manager in state government and have done that job for more than 30 years. you might be surprised to hear that I have no major disagreement with what's been said here this morning. But there is a nuance that I would like to point out and ask for your thoughts on it. Not everybody that comes to us with an open records request is a journalist. Some of them are data aggregators. And all those things we talked about yesterday and all the ills apply there, because a lot of the data that government holds are about individuals. And even if we anonymize it, as we discussed yesterday, there are many ways that these aggregators can tie it back to particular people. We as government really don't want any part of that. We want to be open. We want to let this data out. We want the data to be free, but we don't want to cause any harm. What do you think?
I think that's right. I think the challenge has been that we have separated our policies on transparency and privacy. They're like parallel tracks. And in fact, a transparency policy agenda includes privacy protections. And that's what we need to develop as a comprehensive picture for that. And you're absolutely right. We want to protect not only individual data, but there are, frankly, some things I think government should keep secret. I'm not, a purist. I think there were, for example, after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, I found on the web maps of facilities that were nuclear and could describe where the main operations center was. So why is that drawing up on the internet? I mean, I'm not a purist in this, but I think some common sense needs to be brought, and I think your practical experience should be brought to the policy side so we can combine those.
Scott, do you have a journalist reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, we obviously think about this a lot, and we work really, really hard, and we have better relationships with some agencies than others, and I think there are plenty out there that we understand the problem. We have signed licenses with federal government agencies that we will, we will not try to de-anonymize anything, or that we will not show. We have that schools app that I showed you, the opportunity gap. We agreed, even though we had the data, not to show schools with under a certain number of districts with a certain number of students, because exactly as you said, if you kind of looked at the data in the right way, and if you had a good nerd like me, you could figure out, this is the one kid, who could this possibly be, and reveal somebody's private stuff. So, I mean, I don't know the answer because I only know my own frame, but I know that in journalism we take this very, very seriously. We are very grateful when government agencies don't say to us, you can't have it because it's private, but instead say, you can have it, but it's private. Let's talk about what you can use it for, what you can't use it for. So I think, again, times are changing. It's getting better. I still think we have a long way to go. PIOs are always telling us that their main customers are hedge funds and competitors looking for, companies looking for competitive information. So we kind of get a lot of responses that are strange to us because, this was, why are you blacking out? One of my favorite open government stories is we FOIA'd for the contract for the recovery.gov website, which is this $18 million website. And it was, I don't know if anybody else did, but it was redacted like the CIA, assassination of Mossadegh. I mean, it was like all black pages, and you would really think that like what computers, like which Dell model they were going to buy to run the website was like, top secret information. And they said to us, it's because this company is worried that all of their competitors will be able to use it as a way to kind of get the next contract. So, I mean, we are aware of it. We are I think, again, by doing great work and by being kind of reasonable, we can get past it. But I agree.
That's it.
Okay, this is kind of going back a couple of questions, but I'm very interested in data quality and standards. It's something I spend a good deal of time sort of dealing with, taking these huge, massive amounts of data and transforming them into an analyzable corpus. And I'm curious as to whether you think that there is some sort of, if this filters down to the document retention sort of aspect. Because, document retention isn't just an IT problem. It's not just a processing issue. There's architecture that, there's a whole host of things that go into this. And I wonder if we don't need to sort of change our approach to information retention and document retention. I was wondering if y'all could speak to that a little bit. Thank you.
So from the Reasons Not to Release Data project, I did my favorite and least favorite reason I've actually received from a government was that they lost the data. And there's a couple of different, I've heard this from a couple of different governments. One was it was deleted, and another was in a particular Alabama municipality. They had stored it on DVDs, and DVDs have a shelf life. And that was the archivist's office. And over time, they discovered that all of their data had corroded and lost it. So I totally agree. I think it is actually a document retention problem. I think open data exists because we have the presumptions of public records, and document retention is part of that.
I would also just add in that many years ago, we called it information resources management. And what the language we were trying to convey is we need to think of information as a life cycle. And I don't think we've done a good job with that today. All the way from the point of collection to archiving. Instead, we break it all apart, and we get the kind of problem we were just talking about. We should be thinking about when the information is proposed for collection. You should be thinking about, is that information going to be disseminated? If it's going to be disseminated, how so? What restrictions are to be placed? So you have an understanding from the beginning of the collection, and therefore you're not stuck with, oh, we've got all this data. How do we get it out there now? And that's similarly true with the archiving. So I'm a big fan of that kind of life cycle planning that you were at least implying.
We definitely have time for one more question.
I'm a OSU faculty emerita, but my question is coming from myself as a concerned citizen, a curious citizen. And here in Ohio, we have just learned that the governor's budget is a data-driven budget. But to my knowledge, there's no information online regarding the databases of this budget. And so my question is, I wouldn't even know what the parameters are if I were to ask, and I would probably be told it's all too complicated and too vast to put online. Are there examples of states with data-driven budgets that are published in your data, are included in your data set that one may look at to see examples of how such data is portrayed?
There's a lot of variety. Like many, I would not point you to as like a shining example. Actually, Colorado has one of the oldest websites that at least shows some breakdowns of what feeds into the budget data. I would more so point you to a project called, I think it's NY Spending 2.0 from the city of New York, which finally released their subcontractor data because some of us were being antsy about it. But it shows in detail for each of the boroughs as well as the top level city, which is a nice at least parallel to the functioning of a state government and all the breakdowns that you have to do, how the budget is broken down in detail, how spending allocation is based upon that information, and it has a variety of access points, both for you to look at in terms of graphical representation as well as the actual data itself. I think it's just nyspending2.0.gov.
I would just tack on, I think there are also a lot of different experiences with use of performance data. For example, Oregon has done a great deal with that, building off of what Australia has done. So there's a whole host of models of using performance data in the context of government decision-making and budgeting. I would also say the second thing is, as a citizen, the other thing that happens is you get flooded with information from the government of which you can't pull out the kernel of what is important. That's another reason why you have to have the role of intermediaries to help on all of that.
Thank you.
So just sort of a concluding thought, if you have 30 seconds of reaction to it. I do worry politically about the sort of collective action problem of organizing around information, that the benefits of information are widely distributed, but the people who think they'll be injured by openness, they have a lot at stake. And so, I was on the faculty of the University of Iowa in 1984, and of course, if you're in Iowa City around election time, you get presidential candidates willing to mow your lawn. While Walter Mondale was painting my garage, he said to me in a conversation, I can't get any. I asking him about a Freedom of Information Act issue. He said, I can't motivate a single vote by making this an issue, and I'm wondering how to get around this, if there's a way of getting around this collective action problem.
I mean, I have one sort of tangential reaction to that, and this is something that I think about a lot, and I don't think that I have solved it, and I hope that I can start solving it, or at least start thinking about it, tackling it, which is that using data to tell stories and these intermediaries and kind of exposing data to people so that they can kind of make decisions, it presumes that my readers and my audience are in the kind of position in their lives, the level of class and wealth, and that they can actually control their lives enough so that having data inform it is useful. So I think this is sort of the flip side of the same question, which is not only, first you have to sort of make people see the usefulness of data because they use it themselves. And then I think if they're confronted with the fact that it's about to be taken away from them, then I think you will start moving votes. But I think that the primary, the kind of collinear and primary variable here is exposing data to people so that they can actually control their lives. And I think that there are a tremendous number of people, both for digital divide kind of, data knowledge, don't know that they can do that or are not capable of doing that. Or they are, working 2 jobs and just trying to get by and looking up to see if their doctor takes payments from pharmaceutical companies doesn't really help.
So I think this kind of goes to why most mayors who do pass these open data policies are passing them for the splashy apps that they can make that obviously have an impact, like a bus app. But it's also why, by contrast to that, my favorite open data prioritization effort happened in the city of Philadelphia, where a group of people came together and they asked a bunch of nonprofits, everything from women's shelters to bike clinics, what data would you need to do your job better from the government? And instead of talking in the wonky terms that we use in our own insider circles within big government data, they actually just let, again, the role of the intermediary and also just citizens who care and who might stumble and want to look at legislation from the city in their free time, and there are those people, and I don't think that they're crazy. But they got the intermediaries to translate. And so if you were a women's clinic and you only communicated with your constituencies in person, you're able to have a conversation about it, to identify with your constituency what information you needed. And that would otherwise sound Pollyanna to describe this idea like the community coming together to prioritize. But since it happened, it means it can happen anywhere. And I think it's on us to not use language that prohibits people from participating and to keep our focus so narrow. I think that people, like the digital divide isn't a myth, but it continues to exist because we keep on bemoaning the fact that it exists instead of trying to figure out how to actually build bridges.
One just sort of 10-second addendum to what I was saying. I think that one sign that if you kind of connect with everybody with open data, they will make damn sure it stays around forever. The government actually has you have to sign a contract when you set up a satellite saying that you will give exclusive access to the federal government upon request. But can any of us imagine GPS going away because of the government blocking open access to that? Or any of us imagine the National Weather Service or NOAA not releasing that data to private hands so that you can have an app or a TV station that tells you the weather? So I think there are plenty of examples of open data that will never go away because everyone would really freak out. And I think that's what we have to kind of expand everything.
I think that actually that's where I was going to head was, I'm not as maybe negative as the question you implied. I mean, think about it, how much has changed, whether it's weather data, whether it's cars. I mean, just think about, you go look at miles per gallon and now all this data. Look about food. Go to the grocery store, you have much greater disclosure than you did, say, a decade ago or more. I mean, the list could go on and on and on. It's really quite a powerful change. And forever now, openness is going to be linked to, in some way, the internet or the next generation of the internet. So there is really quite a positive environment. I think as advocates, which all of us are in this room, we're always going to push the envelope to want more because we see the capability of doing much more. And so we forget about how far we've come. We're only thinking about how far we still got to go. And even when we have a president like Obama who gets openness, it's not. A colleague of mine once said, changing government is like moving the ship of state. It takes a long time. Well, it's much harder than that. It's like moving a flotilla of ships simultaneously. And it really takes a heck of a lot of work, more than just what a president can do. And so to complement that, there are coalitions, there are linkages that we need to make between those of us who are doing, say, policy advocacy and those of you who are working on the research or the business side. We should be joining forces to really build something that talks about a common message about an open and accountable government that helps lead to more power for citizens.
Well, on that hopeful action note, let's thank the panel for a terrific series of presentations. So, bad news and good news. The bad news is that those of you who are not speaking, we're not feeding you. But the good news is that in 2 hours at 1:45, we will reconvene, and there will be 2 more panels and a lecture this afternoon. The first panel, starting at 1:45, is going to focus on big data and the social good, health, education, and welfare. And then the second panel of the afternoon will look at big data and the future of cities, and we'll conclude with quite a distinguished lecture by Michael Batty. So please rejoin us at 1:45, and if you are a speaker, we will be feeding you upstairs. Thank you.